Hello and welcome to the start of the fourth week of class. During this week, we will be looking at several aspects of the medieval era, focusing specifically on the occult and supernatural fears that possessed the minds of most Europeans during this period. Beginning with this week, much of your focus should shift towards starting to work on your final project. With this in mind, some of the lectures will be shorter, allowing you more time to focus on this. In addition to this overview lecture, you'll need to watch 3 other lectures for this week. In the next lecture, we will look at several aspects of medieval eschatology, the study of the end times, as well as the witch trials that took place during this period. In the third lecture, we will look at the action RPG Diablo 3 and explore how closely this game reflects how angels, demons, and witches are described during the medieval era. As usual, our final lecture will review the secondary source readings for the week. In terms of readings, you'll have to look at 2 primary sources, selections from Dante's Inferno and from the Malleus Maleficarum. You will likewise have to read 3 additional articles. A chapter from Playing with the Past on representations of the Aztec Empire in Age of Empires 2 and Medieval 2 Total War by Holdenried, an article about how medieval warfare is portrayed in both medieval Total War games by Fedorenko, and an article about the utility of using the video game Dante's Inferno in the classroom by Weissel and Stevens. At the end of this week, in addition to your regular posts and reading summary assignments, you will have to turn in an annotated bibliography. The rest of this lecture will be spent explaining this assignment. The description under this assignment on Elms reads as follows. Find and properly cite, using the Trabian style, 5 sources that might be useful for your final paper. You must have 2 primary sources and 3 scholarly secondary sources from books or academic journals. After each of these entries, write a paragraph in which you 1. Summarize the source, 2. Analyze the author's main argument, and 3. Comment on how useful this source will be for your final paper. In other words, for your annotated bibliography, you're going to find 5 sources. 2 of them must be from the time period in question, primary sources, and the other 3 should be scholarly secondary sources by historians or other scholars who discuss the time period in question. After you find these sources, you are then going to write a paragraph after each one, briefly summarizing the source, analyzing its main argument and evidence, and explaining how the source is going to fit into your own argument for your final project. Before you can evaluate your sources, though, you have to actually find them. One of the best ways to do this is to utilize the many resources that University of Maryland's library has on its website. If you aren't familiar with the university's library website, you go to lib.umd.edu, and this will take you to the site. First, we'll look at how you're going to find your secondary sources. There's 2 main ways that you can go about doing this. The first is to simply search the library catalog based on the topic of your project. For example, if I was interested in looking at how well the Rome Total War games simulate the ancient Roman economy, I could search for something along these lines. If I were to search for Roman economy, we now see a list of books that the library has or has access to that have to do with the economy of the ancient Romans. For example, The Roman Market Economy by Peter Temin. Now, with any secondary source we consider using, we first have to make sure that it's a scholarly source. When it comes to books, the best way to make sure that it's a scholarly source is to look at both the publisher as well as the author. In this case, if we look at the editions and formats, we can see that this book is published by Princeton University Press. Any university press is going to be scholarly. If this book hadn't been published by University Press, we could always open up Google and search for the author, Peter Temin. In this case, what we find is that Peter Temin is a well-known economist and economic historian from MIT. His book, then, The Roman Market Economy, would be a good scholarly secondary source that I could use for my project. The second main way to find good secondary sources is through the library databases. Based on what your topic is, you can search through these different databases. For instance, if I search economy, a whole list of different economic journals and databases are going to come up. One of the best databases that'll work for all of your paper topics and that you should probably start with is the database JSTOR. You can search for it or just look under the J's and find JSTOR here and open it up. JSTOR is a popular database that houses a large collection of journals, primary sources, and books. Most importantly, though, it's going to give you access to scholarly articles from academic journals based on your topic. So again, if we search for the Roman economy, we have all these different articles that are going to come up. For instance, Imperialism, Empire, and the Integration of the Roman Economy. That might be a very good source for my project. When it comes to choosing your secondary sources, other than making sure that it's scholarly, it's often better to choose a source that's been more recently published. While older sources published 20, 50, or even 100 years ago can still be very valuable sources, a source that's been published recently has the advantage of knowing and being able to grapple with all the scholarship that's been published before it. Ultimately, in choosing your secondary sources for your project, I would highly encourage you looking at these scholarly articles because typically they're much shorter and get to the heart of the author's argument much quicker than books do. It's also important both for your annotated bibliography as well as for your final project that some of these secondary sources you bring in focus exclusively on the historical time period. While scholarship that looks at video games and history is important, such as what we've been reading and playing with the past, it's equally important for your project to use sources that focus exclusively on the historical time period you're hoping to analyze. Next, turning to finding your primary sources. One of the easiest and most obvious ways to find primary sources is by first reading your secondary sources. As you may have noticed with the specialized scholarly articles that we read for this class already, in order to have strong arguments, these historians must bring in primary sources to back up their argument. So, for example, if you were trying to find primary sources about the Roman Republic in the 220s BC, rather than try and find all those sources yourself, you might as well go back to the Erdkamp article and see which primary sources he relies on. The second main way to find your primary sources, other than just by Googling for them, is again to go back to the databases for the library. Some of these databases don't just have collections of scholarly articles, but they also have collections of primary sources. Again, if I was interested in finding primary sources about ancient Greece or ancient Rome, I could just plug in Greek into the search bar and see what it gives me. In this case, one of the databases that turns up is the Digital Loeb Classical Library. If we open up this database, we see that it's actually a collection of most of the texts that were published in the ancient world. For example, if I was interested in looking at Caesar's Gallic War, I could just type that into the search bar, and sure enough, it's right here. Opening this up, we can see that we have the actual text of Caesar's Gallic Wars, the original Latin on one side and an English translation on the other. Whether it's texts or archives, these databases through the library website have an enormous amount of primary sources. The last aspect of this is how to properly cite these sources in the bibliography. As part of the description of the assignment on ELMS, you will see a link that will take you to the Purdue OWL Guide to Proper Source Citations. For this class, we will be using the Turabian style to cite our footnotes and bibliography for the final paper. For the annotated bibliography, you should follow this guide with how to promptly format each of your sources. You will mainly be citing either books or articles, so you can go to the left-hand menu here and select either books or periodicals. Let's select books. This will show you the proper format and punctuation for each different type of source. Your sources will largely be either single author books, contributions from an edited collection with various authored chapters. For example, what Playing with the Past is. For some of your primary sources, you may also have to cite them as a translated book with a single author, since many of our primary sources from earlier periods were not written in English. You can likewise find the proper format for citing your journal articles under the Periodicals tab. For all these citations, you will use the bibliographical entry, marked with the B on the website. That's all for this first lecture. As always, if you have any questions with finding your sources or how to properly cite your sources, or any further questions about the annotated bibliography assignment, please don't hesitate to let me know. In our next lecture, we'll look at the history behind the angels, demons, and witches of the medieval world. See you then.